Mackenzie Johnston with Tri-State Livestock News, bringing you discussions concerning fair cattle markets. Today we have the opportunity to chat with Matt Teagarden. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Kansas Livestock Association. Can you just tell me a little bit about your background and your involvement within the cattle industry?
I have been at Kansas Livestock Association since 1999 in various roles, in my current role since 2015. Prior to that, I was in the Cooperative Extension Service here in Kansas. I grew up on a cow-calf and stocker operation in East Central Kansas and went to Kansas State University.
So what do you feel are the major issues standing in the way of fair cattle markets today?
It depends on what fair cattle markets, I think that means different things to different people, but I think if we're looking at increasing cattle prices, maybe improving margins for cattle producers, improving profitability, I think the key piece there is getting our packing capacity in a more favorable balance with our fed cattle supply. And that piece would drive prices higher, would move generally prices higher, improve profitability, those kinds of things. So getting that better balance in our fed cattle supply compared to our packing capacity. We've seen just in Kansas over the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years, significant feed yard expansion, and that has come along with basically just static packing capacity. There's been some improvements around the edges, but for the most part, that increased feeding capacity has been put against a very, very level, very static packing capacity. So I think that's where we could see the most improvement.
What solutions do you think could be implemented to solve this issue?
So if the challenge is packing capacity, I think looking at what it is that is limiting that expansion. There's been profit margins that I think would indicate to a lot of folks that expanding packing capacity would make sense. And there's discussions around that. We've seen some plans for plants in a couple of different regions that would add 500 to 1,000, maybe 1,500 head of capacity a day. That would certainly help, especially if those additions add up to several thousand head a day. So barring that, I think there are some issues that we've talked a lot about. Labor availability, and at least in southwest Kansas, I think that's a limiting factor for packers, but it's also a limiting factor actually for livestock producers as well. And so I think that labor availability is an issue that we've been watching for many years and sought solutions at the federal level to, for more guest workers, that kind of thing. But that hasn't happened. But I think that labor availability is a key issue for being able to expand the packing capacity that we have on the books today.
There has been a lot of talk about increasing negotiated cash trade, and Senator Grassley has introduced the 5014 legislation. What are your thoughts on that legislation?
The Grassley legislation, we are opposed to it. KLA is about protecting our members' ability to make their own business decisions, and that legislation would take that out of their hands. I recognize that it's targeted at packers and how packers procure cattle, but packers only buy cattle from cattle producers. And so if you limit the ways in which packers can procure cattle, you're automatically limiting the ways that cattle producers can sell cattle. And so we oppose that. It's overly prescriptive. It requires negotiated cash transactions. There are other ways to increase negotiated trade without requiring that cash sale. Our Feeders Council members are really focused on increasing negotiated grid transactions. That type of transaction has the benefit of negotiating the base price and increasing the amount of negotiated trade that we have in our business, but still ultimately price those cattle. The ultimate value of those cattle is determined by a grid. And so two benefits: increasing negotiated trade and contributing to price discovery, creating more robust price discovery at the fed cattle level, but still valuing those cattle based on their carcass attributes. And we think that's really important to maintain that, because it sends those market signals back through the feeder, through the stocker background, or back to the cow-calf level, ultimately to our seed stock producers, to the really key in developing the kind of cattle that better meet the needs of our consumers.
There is currently a petition circulating to bring about a beef checkoff referendum. What are your thoughts on this?
The referendum process was included in the original Beef Checkoff Act.
Yep.
And so that process is there for producers, and that's their right. We support the opportunity to trigger a referendum. That threshold is 10% of producers. And so, we would not oppose that effort. I would say this: KLA continues to strongly support the beef checkoff. It is too bad that the referendum process is simply an up or down vote on the checkoff. There are some things that we'd like to see changed in terms of the checkoff and how it operates, but an up or down vote, doesn't give that. That's just an up or down, either yes or no, and so it would be, I think, very devastating for the industry to lose the checkoff altogether. It does a really valuable work connecting with consumers. Just a recent example, the dietary guidelines process, developing the new set of dietary guidelines. Without the beef checkoff, we don't have the nutrition research that was so critical in feeding into that process to maintain beef's position as a source of protein in the diet. That wouldn't be there, and if without the checkoff, we wouldn't. That's just one example of what's at stake if we lose the checkoff.
Earlier this spring, President Trump made the statement that he would like to do away with trade deals where we import cattle. What are your thoughts on imports of beef and cattle?
Specific to cattle, we import cattle from Canada and Mexico. And so those imports tend to augment the cattle supply, in particular in certain regions of the country. In the Northwest, we import some fed cattle from Canada to support plants in that area of the country. Without those imports, we would lose additional packing capacity. And they're really important at certain times of the year when there's holes in the fed cattle supply in that area of the country. Imports from Mexico primarily are feeder cattle, and those cattle come in as lightweight steers, and many of them graze Flint Hills grass here in Kansas and then are fed in Kansas feed yards and then harvested, and many of those products are then shipped back to Mexico as value-added products. So from a live cattle import standpoint, it really augments kind of our production system. When we talk about beef, the majority of our beef imports are lean trimmings that support the ground beef market and add value to our fatty trimmings, the trimmings that are produced from fed cattle harvest that are 50% lean, 50% fat. Those can then be blended with lean trimmings to create ground beef products, hamburgers in fast food restaurants. And so whether it's cattle or beef, those imports complement what we produce here in the U.S. and allows us the opportunity to export products around the world, in large part export products that have very little value here in the U.S., but have significant value in export markets. And so that trade is a net positive. It's been a net positive for many years when you look at all beef products, beef and cattle combined. And so it really supports our industry and gives us an opportunity to sell tongues into Japan and Mexico, sell livers to the Middle East, those types of products that aren't very highly valued here in the U.S., have greater value in export markets and add to the overall value of our cattle.
There is currently a push to implement RFID tags across the cattle industry. What are your thoughts on this?
KLA policy actually supports mandatory traceability for all cattle. We don't get specific about RFID, but I think if you're going to have an effective traceability system, then RFID is a key component of that system. We haven't pursued mandatory traceability. We haven't asked USDA to implement mandatory traceability for all cattle. What we have done is participated in, supported the development of U.S. Cattle Trace, which is an industry-driven traceability system that is focused solely on animal disease traceability and creating a database that would provide the information that animal health officials need in the case of a disease outbreak, a foreign animal disease or otherwise. Those kinds of databases are used for tuberculosis, brucellosis, diseases that we deal with more frequently than the foreign animal diseases, fortunately. So to the extent that RFID is necessary for an effective traceability system, we would be supportive of that. And again, our focus has been on U.S. Cattle Trace, which is a voluntary industry-driven traceability solution.
More than ever, we're seeing consumers wanting to know where their food comes from. What are your thoughts on MCOOL?
We oppose mandatory country of origin labeling. We've had a program, we saw the results of it. It added costs to our business with very little or no measurable benefit. There was no evidence that consumers were willing to pay more for that information. We've opposed mandatory, supported voluntary country of origin labeling. In fact, believe that there is potential for voluntary origin labeling information to earn a premium in the marketplace. But when it's a blanket mandatory labeling program, nearly everything in the retail meat case carried a label that included the U.S. on it. So there was very little opportunity for differentiation. And so I think I would argue that was part of the reason why we didn't see any value from the mandatory program and why a market-driven voluntary program could benefit those that would implement that, whether it's a part of a branded program that has other attributes. We'd support voluntary, opposed mandatory country of origin labeling.
What are your thoughts on the current DOJ investigation into the Big Four beef processors?
That's something that we support. We actually asked USDA initially to investigate the market dynamics. We'd asked for that investigation after the fire at the Finney County plant in Holcomb. And then there in March, when the impact of the coronavirus or COVID-19 started impacting markets, we asked USDA to finish up the investigation after the fire and investigate the market dynamics that we were seeing in March. NCBA then asked the Department of Justice to engage in that effort as well, and we support that. We've seen explanations for the market dynamics that occurred, but USDA, the Department of Justice, have the authority to conduct those investigations and take action if they find any illegal or anti-competitive behavior, and we want them to dig in and dig that out if it occurred and get us the answers. We'd like those answers sooner than later so we can make adjustments as appropriate and then move on.
With these tough times, not just that we've experienced this year with the pandemic, but we've experienced rough markets for the past few years, we've seen independent producers continue to drop out of the game. Do you think the cattle industry is in danger of becoming vertically integrated?
I don't think so. I don't think our business is suited for that with the amount of forage that we utilize, especially in our cow herds. We have cows in, all 50 states because there are forage resources available, and the kind of investment that it would require to vertically integrate all of those resources, it just is astronomical. And actually, more recently, we've seen the business go the other way. We've seen companies that had both packing and feeding interests sell their feeding interests. I don't see that. There's certainly business arrangements that cattle producers are using. I think there's some vertical coordination that's going on, but that's much different than integration. So working together to provide the kind of products that the consumers are wanting, asking for, desiring through vertical coordination. I think that will continue to happen, but I see no possibility of the kind of integration that we've seen in some of the other protein segments.
What are some of the main concerns you're hearing from your members regarding cattle markets and the cattle industry?
I think one that we've heard loud and clear is that we need to ensure that we have effective, robust price discovery at the fed cattle level. We're in agreement, whether it's cattle feeders of all stripes, cow-calf producers in Kansas and across the country. We want to make sure that we have enough negotiated trade to ensure we have robust price discovery. I think there is a distinction among the industry participants in how we get there. Our members are really focused on increasing negotiated trade voluntarily, taking those steps ourselves, and our members are doing that. We have members that are selling more cattle through some negotiated means than they were previously. And that goes back to the previous comment about negotiated grid transactions as opposed to negotiated cash. So I think that is where one of the key things that we've been working on, KLA members have been working on the last 5, 6, 7 months, probably longer than that in reality, but increasing that negotiated trade to ensure that we continue to have robust price discovery is a really key issue for us.
That is all I have for questions. Do you have any closing statements you would like to make regarding the cattle markets?
I think that we certainly have experienced a much different market than what our expectations were when we started 2020. No doubt about that. The disruption from the pandemic, the cattle backlog that we saw because of the reduced workforce in packing plants, just the uncertainty around the overall economy, whether it's here in the U.S. or around the world, has created a much different situation these last few months than what we expected coming into the year. Lots of optimism at the beginning of the year with the deal with China, with growing U.S. demand, an agreement with Japan, just a number of things that the pandemic has disrupted. And one thing that I would stress is being careful about making decisions that would have really long-term impacts on our business based on the experience of the last few months. The last few months were unexpected. We hope that they're not lasting, that we're able to get out of the current circumstances with restaurants shut down and export markets disrupted and everything else.